The Zero came out of the sun, a sliver of polished death against the blinding Pacific blue. It was December 1941, and the air over Wake Island was thick with the smell of cordite and desperation. Inside the cockpit of his Grumman F-4F Wildcat, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Thach felt the world slow to a crawl. He saw the tracers from his own .50 caliber guns arc lazily, harmlessly, behind the impossibly nimble Japanese fighter as it carved a turn that defied physics. It was like trying to hit a hummingbird with a rock. His wingman, a kid from Iowa named Miller, was already gone. A fireball. A brief, sun-bright flare, then nothing. The Zero that killed him had simply rolled, inverted, and vanished into the cloud deck below. It was a slaughter. The Wildcat, America's frontline naval fighter, was obsolete. They all knew it. The reports from China, the whispers from Claire Chennault's flying tigers, had been dismissed. But here, in the burning sky, the truth was inescapable. They were flying coffins. Thach's knuckles were white on the stick. He could feel the vibrations of his own aircraft, a sturdy, rugged machine that now felt like a lumbering ox. Below him, the USS Lexington, his home, was a toy on a vast, indifferent sea. He was a dead man. They were all dead men. They just hadn't stopped breathing yet. And in that moment of certain death, as another Zero lined up on his tail, a fragment of a memory surfaced, not of flight school or tactics, but of his childhood in Arkansas, a box of wooden matches, and a simple, stupid game he'd played with his brothers on the front porch. A game about predicting where someone would step next. The memory was a ghost, a flicker of heat lightning in a brain overloaded with fear. The porch. The smell of pine. The rough wood of the matches. His brother's laughing face. Bet you a nickel I can guess which way you'll jump. The game was simple, you tried to predict the other's evasive move. It was a child's pastime. A distraction. Now, it was the only thing separating him from a fiery death. The Zero behind him fired. A stream of 20mm cannon shells ripped through the air where his Wildcat's tail should have been. He had jerked the stick, a gut reaction, a desperate, uncoordinated jink. The Japanese pilot had anticipated it. He was hurting Thach, playing him. Thach could almost feel the pilot's contempt through the canopy glass. The Wildcat couldn't outturn the Zero. It couldn't outclimb it. It couldn't outdive it by much. In a one-on-one duel, the Wildcat was a dead man walking. He shoved the throttle forward, the Pratt & Whitney engine roaring in protest. He needed time. Just a few seconds. The memory of the matches solidified. He and his brother would lay them out on the porch, a grid. One would move a matchstick, and the other had to block it. It was about patterns. About forcing your opponent into a predictable path. You don't try to hit the hummingbird. You make the hummingbird fly into your swatter. His training screamed at him to break, to roll, to dive. But that was what the Zero pilot expected. That was the dance, and the Zero led every step. Instead, Thach did something that felt like suicide. He leveled his wings. He flew straight, for just a heartbeat. A perfect, stable target. It was an invitation. A taunt. The Zero took the bait. It closed the distance, a shark scenting blood. Thach could see the details now, the red rondelle, the glint of the canopy. He counted in his head. 1, 2. He wasn't trying to escape. He was setting a trap with his own life as the bait. On 3, he stood the Wildcat on its wingtip, a hard, gut-wrenching turn into the Zero's path. It wasn't an escape maneuver. It was a head-on pass. A joust. The Zero pilot, committed to his kill shot, was suddenly faced with a collision. He broke off, instinctively pulling up and away. It was the only move he could make. The only move his training and the physics of his aircraft allowed. And in that moment, Thach saw it. The flaw in the Zero's perfection. Its incredible maneuverability came at a cost. It had to keep its energy, its speed, in a tight, turning fight. A straight line, energy-sapping maneuver like a sudden, defensive break was its weakness. It was predictable. He didn't get a shot. He didn't need one. He had survived the encounter. He had broken the rhythm. He landed back on the Lexington hours later, his fuel gauges reading empty, his body shaking with a cocktail of adrenaline and a terrifying, nascent idea. The deck crew swarmed his plane, pointing at the bullet holes stitched along the fuselage. He ignored them. He climbed out of the cockpit, his legs unsteady, and walked straight to the ready room. He needed a blackboard. He needed to think. The room was silent, haunted. Miller's locker was still open, a photograph of a smiling girl taped inside. The other pilots sat in stunned silence, nursing mugs of cold coffee. They had seen the same thing he had. The utter dominance of the Japanese fighter, one of them muttered, not looking up. It's like they're reading our minds. Thach picked up a piece of chalk. The blackboard was still smeared with the pre-flight briefing from that morning, useless formations, outdated tactics. He erased it with a sweep of his hand. They're not reading our minds, Thach said, his voice low but cutting through the gloom. We're just talking too loud. He drew 2 crude aircraft on the board. One was a Wildcat. The other, a Zero. We've been fighting alone. Every man for himself. That's what they want. They pick us off one by one. He tapped the chalk on the Wildcat. We can't turn with them. We can't run from them. So we stop trying. He drew a line between the 2 Wildcats. We fight as a single organism. A 4-plane section. Not a loose formation. A team. Tied together. He began to move the chalk pieces, describing a pattern. It was a dance, but a new one. A counterintuitive, brutal ballet. 2 Wildcats would fly a gentle, weaving S-pattern across the sky, like 2 threads being braided together. They would be the bait. The steady, predictable element. The Zero will see one of us as a target, Thach explained, his eyes burning with intensity. He'll commit to an attack run from the rear. He'll think he has a clean shot. He moved the Zero piece onto the tail of one Wildcat. But as he closes, he flies right into the guns of my wingman, who is crossing behind me in the weave. He demonstrated, his hands becoming the aircraft. One hand weaved in front of the other. The trailing hand, the wingman's, had a perfect, stationary shot at the Zero as it pursued the lead plane. The Zero, focused on the kill, would be blind to the crossfire. A pilot in the back scoffed. You want us to fly a predictable pattern? That's suicide. We're sitting ducks. We're already sitting ducks. Thach shot back, his voice rising. This isn't about being unpredictable. It's about being collectively predictable. The Zero pilot sees one of us doing something stupid and predictable. He doesn't see the trap because he's not looking for it. He's not looking for 2 aircraft to be working as a single gun platform. He looked around the room, at the faces of the men he was asking to trust him with their lives. The matchstick, he said, almost to himself. You don't watch the matchstick your brother is moving. You watch the space he's trying to get to. You block the path, not the man. He spent the next week drilling his squadron, VF-3. On the deck, with models. In the air, over the open ocean, with camera guns. The first attempts were a disaster. The timing was off. Pilots, conditioned to individualism, broke formation. They turned into each other's paths. They lost sight of the Zero, the theoretical enemy. The language over the radio was a mix of frustration and fear. Brake left. No, your other left. I almost hit you, you idiot. This will never work. But Thach was relentless. He simplified. He drilled the weave into their muscle memory until it was as natural as breathing. He taught them to fly not by looking at their own 6 o'clock, but by watching their wingmans. Their survival was now inextricably linked. Their fates, braided together like the pattern they flew. The breakthrough came on a cloudy Tuesday. Thach was flying with his wingman, Ensign Edward "Butch" O'Hare. They were practicing the weave, their Wildcats dancing a slow, interlocked S across the sky. A lone, unsuspecting SBD Dauntless dive bomber, returning from a training mission, strayed into their airspace. On instinct, Thach called the drill. "Butch, weave right. Now." The two Wildcats crossed. Thach, playing the bait, flew straight and level. O'Hare, crossing behind him, had a perfect, stable gunsight solution on the Dauntless for a full 3 seconds. It was an eternity in air combat. The camera gun footage later showed a kill shot that would have vaporized a Zero. There was silence on the radio. Then, O'Hare's voice, filled with a newfound awe. "My God, Jimmy, it works. It worked in practice. Against a friendly, slow-moving Dauntless." The unspoken question hung in the air, heavy as lead ballast. Would it work against the real thing? Against the agile, murderous Zero? Against pilots who had already tasted blood and found it sweet? They would not have to wait long to find out. The orders came down that evening. The Lexington was steaming towards the Coral Sea. Intelligence pointed to a massive Japanese invasion force. They were going into the heart of the storm. And they were taking their tiny, fragile box of matchsticks with them. One of them muttered, not looking up. "It's like they're reading our minds." Thach picked up a piece of chalk. The blackboard was still smeared with the pre-flight briefing from that morning: useless formations, outdated tactics. He erased it with a sweep of his hand. "They're not reading our minds," Thach said, his voice low but cutting through the gloom. "We're just talking too loud." He drew 2 crude aircraft on the board. One was a Wildcat. The other, a Zero. "We've been fighting alone. Every man for himself. That's what they want. They pick us off one by one." He tapped the chalk on the Wildcat. "We can't turn with them. We can't run from them. So we stop trying." He drew a line between the 2 Wildcats. "We fight as a single organism. A 4-plane section. Not a loose formation. A team. Tied together." He began to move the chalk pieces, describing a pattern. It was a dance, but a new one. A counterintuitive, brutal ballet. 2 Wildcats would fly a gentle, weaving S-pattern across the sky, like 2 threads being braided together. They would be the bait. The steady, predictable element. "The Zero will see one of us as a target," Thach explained, his eyes burning with intensity. "He'll commit to an attack run from the rear. He'll think he has a clean shot." He moved the Zero piece onto the tail of one Wildcat. "But as he closes, he flies right into the guns of my wingman, who is crossing behind me in the weave." He demonstrated, his hands becoming the aircraft. One hand weaved in front of the other. The trailing hand, the wingman's, had a perfect, stationary shot at the Zero as it pursued the lead plane. The Zero, focused on the kill, would be blind to the crossfire. A pilot in the back scoffed. "You want us to fly a predictable pattern? That's suicide. We're sitting ducks. We're already sitting ducks." Thach shot back, his voice rising. "This isn't about being unpredictable. It's about being collectively predictable. The Zero pilot sees one of us doing something stupid and predictable. He doesn't see the trap because he's not looking for it. He's not looking for 2 aircraft to be working as a single gun platform." He looked around the room, at the faces of the men he was asking to trust him with their lives. "The matchstick," he said, almost to himself. "You don't watch the matchstick your brother is moving. You watch the space he's trying to get to. You block the path, not the man." He spent the next week drilling his squadron, VF-3. On the deck, with models. In the air, over the open ocean, with camera guns. The first attempts were a disaster. The timing was off. Pilots, conditioned to individualism, broke formation. They turned into each other's paths. They lost sight of the Zero, the theoretical enemy. The language over the radio was a mix of frustration and fear. Brake left. No, your other left. I almost hit you, you idiot. This will never work. But Thach was relentless. He simplified. He drilled the weave into their muscle memory until it was as natural as breathing. He taught them to fly not by looking at their own 6 o'clock, but by watching their wingmen's. Their survival was now inextricably linked. Their fates, braided together like the pattern they flew. The breakthrough came on a cloudy Tuesday. Thach was flying with his wingman, Ensign Edward "Butch" O'Hare. They were practicing the weave, their Wildcats dancing a slow, interlocked S across the sky. A lone, unsuspecting SBD Dauntless dive bomber, returning from a training mission, strayed into their airspace. On instinct, Thach called the drill. "Butch, weave right. Now." The two Wildcats crossed. Thach, playing the bait, flew straight and level. O'Hare, crossing behind him, had a perfect, stable gunsight solution on the Dauntless for a full 3 seconds. It was an eternity in air combat. The camera gun footage later showed a kill shot that would have vaporized a Zero. There was silence on the radio. Then, O'Hare's voice, filled with a newfound awe. "My God, Jimmy, it works. It worked in practice. Against a friendly, slow-moving Dauntless." The unspoken question hung in the air, heavy as lead ballast. Would it work against the real thing? Against the agile, murderous Zero? Against pilots who had already tasted blood and found it sweet? They would not have to wait long to find out. The orders came down that evening. The Lexington was steaming towards the Coral Sea. Intelligence pointed to a massive Japanese invasion force. They were going into the heart of the storm. And they were taking their tiny, fragile box of matchsticks with them. The Coral Sea was a vast, empty blue, a deceptive calm that hid the storm gathering beneath its surface. Aboard the USS Lexington, the atmosphere was a thick fog of tension, thick enough to taste, a metallic mix of fear, engine oil, and stale coffee. In the ready room, the air was still, heavy with the weight of the coming hours. Lieutenant James Thach stood before his pilots, the chalkboard behind him clean except for 2 simple, interlocking curves, the weave. It looked deceptively simple. A child's drawing. A death sentence, some still thought. "Remember the pattern," Thach said, his voice cutting through the silence. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Forget everything you learned about dogfighting. Your job is not to kill the Zero on your tail. Your job is to make sure your wingman kills him. Your survival is his crosshair. His survival is yours. We are not 4 pilots. We are one weapon." He looked at each man in turn. Butch O'Hare, steady and focused. The others, their faces pale but set, their jaws tight. They had practiced until the weave was a part of their nervous system, a dance they could perform in their sleep. But practice was one thing. The real thing was a different beast entirely. A klaxon blared, shattering the quiet. A voice boomed over the 1MC, "Pilots, man your planes. Bogies inbound. Many bogies." The room erupted into controlled chaos. The pilots grabbed their helmets and life vests, moving with a frantic, purposeful energy. Thach caught O'Hare's eye for a second. A nod. Nothing more. Then they were running, pounding across the non-skid deck, the wind whipping at their flight jackets. The flight deck was a symphony of organized madness. Plane directors waved their arms, engines coughed to life, then roared, their propellers becoming invisible discs that shimmered in the humid air. The smell of high-octane avgas was overwhelming. Thach climbed into his Wildcat, the cockpit a familiar, cramped sanctuary. The crew chief helped him strap in, slapping the canopy frame twice, a gesture of good luck. Thach gave a thumbs up, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. One by one, the Wildcats were catapulted into the sky, the violent, neck-snapping acceleration pushing him back into his seat. He formed up with his section, for aircraft, weavers, and bait. They climbed, gaining altitude, the Lexington shrinking to a toy boat in an immense, blue desert. The radio chatter was minimal, professional. They were saving their breath. Then, they saw them. A smudge on the horizon at first, then a swarm. Dozens of Japanese aircraft, sleek Aichi-Val dive bombers and Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, shielded by a halo of weaving, protective Zeros. The sun glinted off their canopies. It was an armada. The sheer scale of it was enough to freeze the blood. "All right, boys," Thach's voice was calm over the radio, a steadiness he did not feel. "Remember the matchsticks. Execute the weave." The 4 Wildcats began their dance. Thach and his wingmen started the gentle, weaving S-pattern. The other 2, the second element, mirrored them, creating a moving box of overlapping fields of fire. To the Japanese, it must have looked bizarre. A clumsy, slow-moving formation. An easy kill. The Zeros took the bait. They peeled off from the bomber stream, their pilots eager for the slaughter. They fell on the Wildcats like hawks. The first Zero screamed in, aiming for Thach's element. Thach saw the tracers reach for him. His every instinct screamed to break, to dive, to run. He fought it down. He held his course. He was the matchstick. "Butch, he's on me," Thach said, his voice tight. "I see him, Jimmy." "Steady, steady." The Zero closed, its pilot confident, lining up the kill shot. He never saw O'Hare. As Thach flew straight, O'Hare, crossing behind him in the weave, had a perfect, no-deflection shot. The Zero flew right into his gunsight. O'Hare's .50 caliber spoke, a short, brutal burst. The Zero seemed to fly apart in mid-air, its wings folding back, a brief flower of flame and then nothing but falling debris. The radio crackled. Splash 10. O'Hare's voice was flat, devoid of triumph. It was just a fact. The trap had been sprung. The pattern was working. Chaos erupted, but it was a controlled chaos on the American side. The Zeros, confused, found their attacks foiled again and again. They would latch onto a Wildcat's tail, only to find another Wildcat sliding into place behind them, its guns already firing. It was a reversal of the natural order. The hunter became the hunted in the blink of an eye. Thach saw another Zero lining up on one of his men in the second element. "Element 2, we've left. Now." The 2 Wildcats crossed, and as the Zero committed, it was met with a converging wall of fire from the crossing aircraft. It shuddered, belched black smoke, and spiraled down. The sky became a tangled web of tracers, smoke, and dying aircraft. The smell of cordite seeped into Thach's cockpit. He could feel the concussions of near misses. He was flying on pure instinct now, his body performing the weave without conscious thought. See a Zero. Call the cross. Watch it fall. A Zero, more cunning than the others, tried to break the pattern. It made a feint, then pulled up into a steep climb, trying to get above the weave. But the weave was three-dimensional. Thach called for a climb, and the 4 Wildcats ascended as a single entity, maintaining their relative positions, their interlocking fields of fire reaching upward. The Zero, stalling at the top of its climb, was a sitting duck. 2 Wildcats fired simultaneously. It vanished in a ball of fire. The fight was a whirlwind of violence and precision that lasted mere minutes. But in those minutes, the impossible happened. The outclassed Wildcats, flying a tactic born from a childhood memory, were holding their own. They were not just surviving, they were dominating. As the last of the Japanese bombers, harried and disrupted, dropped their payloads harmlessly into the sea, the remaining Zeros broke off. The sky, moments ago a hell of noise and fire, fell silent. The 4 Wildcats regrouped, their ammunition low, their fuel tanks nearing empty. Thach keyed his radio. Report. Sound off. O'Hare here. Element 2 lead, here. Element 2 wingman, here. All 4. They had all made it. Thach let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked out at his wingmen, their Wildcats bearing the scars of battle, bullet holes in wings, torn fabric on the control surfaces. But they were flying. They were alive. As they turned for home, the immensity of what they had accomplished began to settle on him. They had not just survived an engagement with a superior enemy. They had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. The matchstick trick, the simple, stupid game, had worked. But the victory felt hollow, tempered by the sight of the burning ocean below, where other American ships had not been so lucky. The Lexington herself was hit, smoke pouring from her deck. They had won the battle in the air, but the war at sea was far from over. And as he guided his battered Wildcat back towards the wounded carrier, a new, more chilling thought began to form. They had proven the weave could work. Now, every Zero pilot in the Pacific would be studying it, looking for its weakness. The element of surprise was gone. The next dance would be different. The next dance would be against an enemy who had learned the steps. The return to Pearl Harbor was a somber homecoming. The USS Lexington, the beloved Lady Lex, was gone, sent to the bottom of the Coral Sea. The pilots of VF-3 transferred to the USS Yorktown, a carrier rushing into repairs after being mauled at Coral Sea. They were no longer just pilots, they were relics of a lost ship, their survival a bittersweet testament. The mood at Pearl was electric, but with a dark current of dread. Intelligence whispered of a massive Japanese thrust towards a place called Midway. This was not just another battle. This was the entire war, balanced on a knife's edge. In the temporary ready room, the air was thick with the smell of fresh paint and anxiety. Thach stood before his men, but also before a new audience, skeptical pilots from the Yorktown's own squadrons. He redrew the weave on the blackboard, the simple curves now carrying the weight of proven combat. It's not a dogfight, Thach explained, his voice hoarse from repetition. It's a drill. A mechanical drill. You don't think. You execute. Your wingman's life is your responsibility. Your life is his. A senior pilot from the Yorktown, a lieutenant commander with a skeptical frown, interrupted. Thach, your weave might have worked once. A fluke. The Japs will have adapted. They're not stupid. They'll just avoid the cross and pick us off from a distance. Thach met his gaze, his eyes tired but unwavering. They can't. To attack the bombers, they have to commit. They have to come through us. And if they try to engage from a distance, they're ineffective. Their cannons are short range. They have to get close. He tapped the board. This forces them to get close on our terms. Not theirs. He saw the doubt in their eyes. He felt it himself. The lieutenant commander was right. The Japanese were quick, intelligent, adaptable. The element of surprise was gone. The weave was now a known quantity. What if the Zero pilots had their own counter? What if the next time, the trap snapped shut on the trappers? The memory of the Coral Sea was a ghost in the room. The victory felt distant, overshadowed by the loss of the Lexington and the looming, apocalyptic scale of Midway. Thach found himself in the base's intelligence shack, poring over after-action reports and the few grainy gun camera films they had. He was looking for something, anything, a flaw in his own creation, a tell in the Zero's response. He found a fragment. A radio intercept, a Japanese pilot's frustrated transmission, translated by a weary linguist. The American beasts fly like linked demons. They are one creature. I cannot find the kill. Linked demons. The phrase sent a chill down his spine. It was exactly what he was going for. But it also confirmed his fear. The Japanese high command knew. They would be preparing. The days blurred into a cycle of frantic briefings and nerve-wracking waiting. The repair crews worked around the clock on the Yorktown, a 72-hour miracle of sweat and determination that patched the wounded ship back together. Thach drilled his expanded group of pilots relentlessly. He paired the seasoned weavers from VF-3 with the new men, forcing them to build the same unspoken trust. He saw the moment it clicked in a pilot's eyes, the shift from individual survival to collective responsibility. It was the most important weapon they had. Then, the order came. The fleet was moving out. Midway. The launch, days later, was a moment of surreal calm. The Pacific was a flat, gray sheet. The sky, empty. The tension was a physical presence, a sixth sense of impending storm. Thach sat in his cockpit, running through the drill in his mind. The weave. The cross. The timing. It was all they had. It was everything. When the contact report came, it was both a relief and a horror. The Japanese fleet was here. The scope was unimaginable. 4 carriers. The very heart of the Kido Butai. Then, the first waves of Japanese aircraft were spotted, heading for Midway Island itself. The American carriers launched everything they had. The air groups became separated, a chaotic, uncoordinated response. Thach's Wildcat squadron, along with a handful of others, was one of the few organized elements in the sky. Their job was clear: protect the fleet. They climbed, gaining altitude over the American task force. The wait was agony. Then, they saw the enemy. Not the scattered formations they expected, but a concentrated, disciplined swarm of Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, flying low and slow towards the American carriers. And above them, the protective screen of Zeros. Dozens of them. This was different. This was not the Coral Sea. This was the main event. "All right, boys," Thach's voice was preternaturally calm over the radio. "This is it. Remember the drill. We are the wall. Nothing gets through." The Zeros saw them and dove. The sky erupted. It was chaos of a magnitude Thach could never have imagined. The Japanese pilots were aggressive, skilled, and numerous. They came in from all angles, trying to overwhelm the American fighters through sheer mass. Thach called the weave. The 4 Wildcats in his section began their dance. But almost immediately, the pressure was immense. 2 Zeros attacked at once. Thach, as the bait, held his course as tracers zipped past his canopy. "Butch, now." O'Hare's gun spoke, and 1 Zero disintegrated. But the second, quicker, adjusted and stayed on Thach's tail. The weave was designed for 1 attacker at a time. This was multiple, simultaneous threats. Thach yelled. The second element of Wildcats crossed, their fire forcing the second Zero to break off. But in doing so, they exposed themselves. A third Zero, lurking above, pounced on Element 2's wingman. It was a devastating, surgical kill. Thach saw the Wildcat explode, a silent, terrible flower of fire and metal. No parachute. The first loss. The weave was breached. A cold fury settled over Thach. The pattern was being tested, stretched to its breaking point. The Zeros were learning, trying to exploit the moments when the Wildcats were most vulnerable, during the cross itself. "Tighten the weave," he ordered. "Reduce the leg length. Don't give them time to react." They adjusted, flying a tighter, more frantic pattern. It was more dangerous, the risk of mid-air collision skyrocketing. But it also shortened the window of vulnerability. The sky became a dizzying carousel of crossing aircraft, tracers, and burning wrecks. Thach lost all sense of time and space. He was a component in a machine, his eyes constantly scanning, his voice a steady stream of commands. We've left, he's on you, Butch, I'm crossing, splash 1. Break right, break right. Crossing now. His world shrank to the cockpit, his wingmen, and the killing zone of the weave. He saw a 0 line up a perfect shot on O'Hare. There was no time to call the cross. Thach did the only thing he could. He broke the pattern. He turned directly into the Zero's path, a head-on ramming threat that forced the Japanese pilot to veer away. It was an act of pure instinct, of sacrifice. The weave was a drill, but the men within it were not machines. The battle was a furious, bloody stalemate high above the fleet. Below, the American dive bombers, arriving almost by miracle, found the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable. The world exploded. The sea itself seemed to erupt as bombs found their marks on the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The Japanese combat air patrol, including the Zeros engaged with Thach, watched in horror as their homes, their fuel, their ammunition, their comrades, vanished in cataclysmic fireballs. The fight went out of them. The Zeros, suddenly orphaned, low on fuel and with nowhere to land, became desperate. The weave, which had been holding against a disciplined enemy, now became a slaughter against a broken one. The trapped, panicked Zeros made mistakes, flying predictably into the crossfire. Thach's squadron cut them down. When the last Zero broke off, fleeing towards a horizon without hope, the silence was deafening. Thach's section was down to 3 aircraft. They were riddled with bullets, their fuel was critical, but they were alive. They had held the line. As they turned towards the Yorktown, Thach looked out at the burning Pacific. 3 Japanese carriers were infernos. The American dive bombers had won the battle. But his Wildcats, with their matchstick weave, had bought them the time. They had occupied the lethal Zero screen, keeping them away from the vulnerable SBDs and TBDs. The tactic had worked. It had worked on the grandest stage, against the worst odds. But as he guided his shot-up Wildcat back to a damaged, listing Yorktown, the cost was etched into his soul. The lost wingman. The near misses. The constant, grinding fear. The weave was not a magic trick. It was a brutal, pragmatic necessity, a shared agreement to risk everything for the man next to you. He had proven its value beyond any doubt. But as he felt the jarring impact of his wheels on the Yorktown's deck, new, more profound questions settled over him, heavier than any fatigue. In saving so many, by creating a tactic that would change the air war, how many lives had he ultimately consigned to this brutal, mechanical dance of death? The classroom was a different kind of cockpit, and the silence of the young aviators was a different kind of pressure. They stared at him, these boys who had never felt the gut-wrenching lurch of a near miss or smelled the acrid tang of their own aircraft burning. They saw a hero. He saw a room full of potential ghosts. The weave is a confession, Thach repeated, his voice low and gravelly, stripped of any heroic pretense. It is an admission that we are not the better pilots. That we do not have the better aircraft. It is an acknowledgement of weakness. And from that honesty, we find our only strength. He turned to the blackboard, the chalk feeling foreign in his hand, a tool for theory instead of survival. He drew the 2 curves, the interlocking S-pattern that was now etched into his soul. But this time, he added new elements. Arrows representing the Zero's attacks. Dotted lines showing the kill zone. You are not flying an aircraft, he said, tracing the path of the weaving Wildcat. You are flying a part of a system. Your wingman's 6 o'clock is your responsibility. Your life is his crosshair. If he dies, it is because you failed to be where you were supposed to be. It is that simple. It is that heavy. He saw a young ensign in the front row, his face eager, nodding along. Thach focused on him. What's your name, son? Ensign Parker, sir. Parker. You're weaving. Your wingman is crossing. A Zero is on your tail. What do you do? I hold my course, sir. I maintain the pattern. Why? To give my wingman a stable firing solution, sir. And if the Zero's bullets are chewing into your elevator? If you're on fire? The ensign's confidence wavered. I hold, sir. Thach leaned forward, his palms flat on the lectern. You hold. You die in the pattern. Because your death might save the other 3 men in your section. Your death has a purpose. That is the calculus. That is the weave. It is not a trick. It is a pact. The room was utterly silent. The hero worship in their eyes had been replaced by a dawning, sober understanding. He was not teaching them how to be aces. He was teaching them how to be a cog in a machine that valued the survival of the unit over the survival of the individual. It was the antithesis of every romantic notion of aerial combat they'd ever held. He dismissed them, watching them file out, their shoulders a little less straight, their chatter subdued. His executive officer, a young commander named Stiles, approached. That was intense, Jimmy. You scared the hell out of them. Good, Thach said, his eyes distant. Fear is appropriate. Complacency gets you killed. He gestured to the empty chairs. They think the weave is a sword. It's not. It's a shield. A desperate, last-ditch shield. The war, however, was changing. The intelligence reports that crossed his desk now spoke of a new American fighter, the F-6F Hellcat. It was bigger, faster, tougher, with more firepower. It was designed to beat the Zero on its own terms. The first units were arriving in the Pacific. Thach was sent to oversee the transition with a new squadron. The feeling on the deck of the USS Enterprise was different. There was a new confidence, a swagger. The pilots flying the Hellcats looked at the battle-hardened Wildcat pilots with a mixture of respect and pity. Their new mount was a beast. They didn't need clever tricks. Thach gathered the Hellcat pilots in the ready room. He started to draw the weave on the board. A lieutenant, a hotshot with a confident smirk, spoke up. With all due respect, Commander, we've been studying the performance specs. The Hellcat can outclimb, outdive, and outgun the Zero. We can take them in a straight-up fight. We don't need to weave. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Thach put the chalk down slowly. He looked at the confident young faces, so like his own had been before Wake Island. You're right, Thach said, his voice quiet. The Hellcat is a superior aircraft. On paper. He let that hang for a moment. But the Zero is still more maneuverable. And the man flying it is still a samurai. He has been fighting this war since 1937. He will die before he yields. He knows things about air combat that you cannot learn from an unfinished drawing the weave. This is not about the machine. It is about the mind. It is about fighting as a team against a force that values individual glory. The weave forces discipline. It forces you to watch your wingman's back instead of chasing your own kill. The Hellcat gives you the power to make the weave lethal. It is not an either-or choice. It is a multiplier. He saw the skepticism remain. They would have to learn the hard way. And they did. The first major combat for the new Hellcat squadrons was over the Philippine Sea, in what the pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The sky was filled with American aircraft, and the Japanese naval air arm was being systematically annihilated. Thach, flying a command and control aircraft, watched the battle unfold on the radar plot and over the radio. At first, it was a rout. The Hellcats, with their superior performance and better training, tore into the inexperienced Japanese pilots. But then, the veterans of the Japanese Corps, the few that remained, began to fight back. And the old, familiar patterns emerged. He heard a frantic radio call from a Hellcat pilot. He's on my tail. I can't shake him. This guy's good. The pilot broke formation, trying to use his Hellcat's power in a solo duel. It was what the Zero pilot wanted. The fight descended, turning into a swirling, individualistic dogfight where the Zero's agility could still tell. The Hellcat pilot was shot down. But then, another voice, calmer, cut through the chaos. It was one of the pilots from Thach's old squadron, now flying a Hellcat. Red 2, on me. Execute the weave. Now. Thach watched on the plot as the two blips representing the Hellcats began the familiar, interlocking dance. The Zero, committed to its kill, followed one of them. The cross came. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns, far more potent than the Wildcat's 4, spoke with finality. The Zero vanished from the plot. It happened again and again. The pilots who dismissed the weave died alone. The pilots who used it, even in their superior aircraft, survived and killed. The tactic had evolved. It was no longer a desperate shield for an inferior plane. It was a disciplined sword for a superior one. After the battle, the confident lieutenant who had questioned Thach sought him out on the deck. His smirk was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out look of exhaustion and new understanding. "You were right, Commander," the lieutenant said, his voice quiet. "It's not about the plane. It's about, not fighting alone." Thach just nodded. The lesson had been learned. The cost, as always, had been paid in blood. The war swept onward, a tide of steel and fire pushing relentlessly towards Japan. Thach's weave was now standard doctrine, printed in manuals, taught in every training command. He had succeeded. He had created a legacy that was saving countless lives. But as he watched new, ever more advanced aircraft roll off the assembly lines, he felt a strange disconnect. The weave had been born of absolute necessity, a child of desperation and fear in the skies over Wake Island. It was a specific solution to a specific, terrifying problem. Now, it was becoming institutionalized, a piece of dogma. He wondered if, in the next war, some young pilot would blindly follow the weave against a new enemy for which it was utterly unsuited, and die because of it. He had given the Navy a tactic. But had he taken away its ability to think? The question haunted him. He had started a war trying to outthink a superior enemy. He was ending it worried that he had fostered a generation that might not think for itself at all. The end of the war came not with a bang, but with a silence that was somehow louder than all the explosions that had preceded it. For James Thach, the news of the Japanese surrender, received in a quiet office in Washington, D.C., felt like a distant rumor. There were no cheers, no cathartic release. There was only a profound, echoing emptiness. The machine he had helped build had achieved its purpose, and now it was shutting down. The relentless pressure that had been his constant companion for 4 years simply vanished, leaving a vacuum filled with ghosts. He walked the streets of the capital, watching the celebrations, the confetti, the dancing, the drunken, joyous singing. He felt like an imposter. A specter from another world. These people were celebrating the end of a thing they had only experienced through headlines and ration books. They had not felt the hydraulic shudder of a failing turret. They had not smelled the cordite and the sea. They had not seen the face of a young ensign moments before he vanished into fire. He was assigned to the monumental task of demobilization, of dismantling the vast naval air arm he had helped create. It was an administrative nightmare, a sea of paperwork and logistics. He sat in sterile offices, reviewing reports on aircraft disposal, pilot discharges, and base closures. The names of the pilots were just numbers now, service records to be processed and filed away. He would look at a photograph attached to a file, a smiling, young face, and his mind would supply the memory of that same face, pale and terrified in a ready room before a mission. Or worse, he would remember the ones who had no file left to close. The weave was now enshrined in naval doctrine. It was taught at Annapolis, diagrammed in flight manuals, celebrated in press reports. He was hailed as a visionary, a tactical genius. They gave him medals, promoted him to captain. He gave lectures where he explained the mechanics of the tactic with clinical precision, the same way one might explain the function of a carburetor. He never mentioned the matchsticks. He never spoke of the gut-churning fear that was the tactic's true fuel. The audience saw a war hero. He saw a man who had systematized survival, turning human beings into interlocking parts of a killing machine. The memories did not fade, they crystallized. He would be at a dinner party, listening to the polite chatter, and a sudden, unbidden image would flash in his mind, the Zero from the Coral Sea, the one that had flown apart in front of O'Hare's guns. He would see the intricate pattern of the rivets on its wings a split second before they were torn to shreds. The laughter around the table would become the shriek of a dying engine. The clink of a wine glass would be the sound of .50 caliber shells hitting the feed tray. He sought out the men who had flown with him. Butch O'Hare was gone, killed in action later in the war. Others were scattered across the country, trying to bury their own ghosts under a mountain of normalcy. When they did meet, the conversations were halting, filled with long, heavy silences. They spoke of the good times, the pranks, the liberty in Pearl. They never spoke of the weave. They didn't have to. It was the invisible thread that bound them, a shared trauma that was also their proudest achievement. It was a paradox that could not be spoken aloud. In 1950, the war machine rumbled back to life in Korea. Thach was called back to active duty. The aircraft were different now, jets, screaming across the sky at speeds he could barely comprehend. The F-9F Panthers and the MiG-15s were a new evolution, but the fundamental problems were the same. He found himself in another ready room, facing another generation of young pilots. They looked at him with the same hero worship he had seen in 1943. He stood before the blackboard. He picked up the chalk. For a long moment, he just stared at the empty green space. Then, he drew the two curves. The weave. The room was silent. These jet pilots, masters of a new technological warfare, looked at the simple diagram with curiosity. It seemed antiquated, a relic from a slower, more primitive time. This, Thach said, his voice older, wearier, but with the same underlying steel, is not a tactic. It is a principle. It is the principle that your survival is tied to the man next to you. That your individual skill is less important than your collective discipline. The aircraft change. The weapons change. That truth does not. He taught them the weave, adapting it for the blistering speeds of jet combat. He saw the same dawning understanding in their eyes. The realization that the machine, for all its power, was not enough. They practiced it, and it worked. Again. The principle, born from a box of matches on an Arkansas porch, had transcended its time. It was in Korea that he finally found a fragment of peace. Not in the fighting, but in the continuity. The war was still a brutal, filthy business. But he was no longer just a weapon. He was a teacher. A link in a chain. He was passing on the hard-won knowledge, not just of a tactic, but of the mindset required to survive the chaos of combat. He was ensuring that the lessons paid for with the blood of his friends in the Coral Sea and at Midway would not be forgotten. He retired from the Navy a full admiral, his legacy secure. He had one of the most brilliant tactical minds of his generation. He had saved countless lives. He had helped win a war and shape the doctrine of another. But in his quiet study at home, surrounded by medals and citations, the quietest question of all remained. He would take out a simple box of wooden matches from his desk drawer. He would lay them out on the polished wood, forming the same grid he had with his brother a lifetime ago. He had turned a child's game into a doctrine of death and survival. He had outthought a formidable enemy and given his country an edge when it had none. He would look at the matches, these tiny, fragile sticks of wood and phosphorus, and he would wonder. Was the greatest victory of his life the 12 zeros in 4 minutes? Or was it the simple, human connection of a game played with his brother on a warm summer evening, a memory of peace that the war had never been able to completely erase? The matches never answered. They just lay there, silent testament to the terrifying, beautiful, and unpredictable alchemy of the human mind. The story of James Thach and the Weave is more than a tale of aerial combat. It is a lesson in how the human spirit can innovate under the most extreme pressure, turning a childhood memory into a tool for survival. It reminds us that sometimes, the most powerful weapons are not made of steel, but of ideas, trust, and the unwavering commitment to the person flying beside you. If this story of ingenuity and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds moved you, please like this video. It helps us preserve these crucial lessons from history. Subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories that explore the minds and moments that changed the course of the war. Comment where you're watching from: Texas, Germany, Australia. Your engagement helps this history reach a global audience. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.